Hi everyone, I'm Hannah and I'm a med student at Sydney Uni, and today I'm going to be sharing my own personal tips on what helped me do well on the GAMSAT with minimal study. Before I begin, I'd just like to emphasize that everything in this video is my own personal opinion. I'm not really sure if it's legit or not, and it's definitely not endorsed by anyone else. Firstly, let's talk about the GAMSAT itself. So we know that the GAMSAT is a test that is fundamentally testing the way in which you think and not what you know. Therefore, it is far more high yield to be using your study time to be doing practice questions as opposed to studying theory. I know that many of you guys may feel like you've got holes in your knowledge and be so tempted to just sit down with your textbooks and study theory, but especially if you have a science background, I really implore you not to do that and instead just launch yourself into those practice questions, and then when you come across a concept that you're unfamiliar with or you don't remember or you get a question wrong, then use that as a guide as to, what to revise on or brush up on and go back to your notes that way. For those of you who don't have a science background, it definitely does pay off to have a quick look at the theory overall. So Khan Academy is a great resource, but if you're after a textbook, I really find that the Exam Crackers series, the biology, chemistry and the physics textbooks are quite simply written, and after each section they have a section of questions as well that just consolidate what you've learned. So if you do have the time and you don't have a science background, then I recommend Exam Crackers, read through the theory, then attempt those practice questions and go from there. When you do any practice questions, it's important to not only obviously do the question, but to understand why the right answer is correct and why the other answers are incorrect. Most of the resources for GAMSAT do have a little paragraph explanation in the answers after each multiple choice question that explains why that answer was correct and why the other ones are wrong, and I really recommend that you read that section because it just helps you understand the way in which the exam's written, how the questions are written, what they're thinking, what they're trying to get you to see, and can also help shape the way in which you're approaching those questions. If you find that after reading the paragraph at the end and after doing the questions you are still struggling to understand how you're supposed to be thinking in the GAMSAT, then I do recommend potentially considering getting a GAMSAT tutor, just someone to help you understand the thought process, because if you don't understand the thought process behind the exam, then it is really hard to know what they're looking for and therefore do well when you're actually doing the exam. In terms of actual resources, the best resource by far is the practice questions that you can purchase when you are registering for the GAMSAT, so from ASA itself. And that's because those official questions oftentimes have come from old exams, but they do generally give you quite an accurate indication of what to expect in the actual exam. So if you don't have a chance to get anything else, I do recommend at the bare minimum just purchasing those additional GAMSAT practice papers and going through those and reading the solutions for those as well. If you're super organized, you've finished the practice questions and you want something else, Des O'Neill's is always a great choice, especially for section 1. The section 3 questions I do find are a little bit outdated, and they do seem to be a little bit more content heavy than the actual GAMSAT questions, so just bear that in mind when you're doing section 3 practice questions. If they're really heavy on theory, then that's probably not the best use of your time. You want to be doing practice questions that are testing application of theory, not the theory itself. I personally really like the Kaplan series of practice questions for the MCAT. I purchased those books. I don't really use them, but just flicking through them, they do look like they're pretty good, so I would recommend those as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the GAMSAT itself. The first obvious thing is to finish the exam, and I know it's really hard to do because there's a lot of questions with not that much time and it's really exhausting, but if you don't finish the GAMSAT exam, you're already significantly disadvantaging yourself and are much less likely to get in those higher percentiles, so you do want to make sure that you finish the exam if possible. How I personally ensure that I'm sticking to time is, so for example, section 1 has 75 questions for 100 minutes when I did it, so I say, okay, so that's about 33 minutes per 25 questions. So I'll have not just keeping an eye on the clock in general, I'll write on my exam paper what time I should be at a certain question, so that when I get to that question I can check back at the time and make sure I'm on schedule. So I think if you just have more checkpoints for time within the exam, that's really helpful to sticking to time, as opposed to just keeping one eye on the clock and knowing when it finishes overall. Secondly, the way in which the GAMSAT is marked is that they take a performance in each individual question and then accumulate that together. So you might be asking yourself, which questions are more high yield then if they are all technically worth the same amount of marks? And I don't know if this is legit, but for me, my thinking is, okay, we know that a lot of people don't finish the exam, so that means that if you get the last couple of questions correct that a lot of other people are guessing, you're automatically going to be put in a higher percentile for those questions, because by default less people have attempted them and more people have guessed the answer and are therefore more likely to get it wrong. So with that in mind, what I like to do is I start at the start of the exam, move through the exam in chronological order, and then as soon as I hit a question that I'm not really sure of, I'll stop, go straight to the end, and then work my way backwards for the rest of the exam. And by doing that, I make sure that I have enough time to spend on those last couple of questions that I know a lot of people are going to be rushing and not reading and guessing at the end. And hopefully that means that when they look at the percentiles for each individual questions, I would have performed better in those questions relatively to everyone else, and then when they scale that together, hopefully that means overall you'll be in a high percentile. Okay, so what about section 2? In order to do well in section 2, and section 2 is the section that can vary the most, so you really do want to make sure you're hitting high marks in this section, because that can really make a huge difference to your score. The key thing to do is make sure that when you look at the question, you always explain more than one facet. So for example, in last year's GAMSAT, the question was about population control as a means to solve climate change. So if you want to do a good essay, you don't just pick a side like yes it'll help climate change or no it won't help climate change and then argue that. You need to actually explain both sides. And potentially even a third side. If you can get the third side, you know you're going to do well. So for me, when I looked at that question, I said, okay, population control to affect climate change. Well, so you start off with, okay, we know that climate change is getting worse, especially because we have an increasing population size. That's a larger demand for resources, etc. But and so therefore, if we do reduce the population, we know that we are reducing the demand for non-renewable resources, and therefore that may affect climate change. But the key thing to identify here is that it might slow climate change, but it doesn't necessarily solve climate change. So for me, that's how I started, and then I talked about how, okay, let's have a look at some countries that already are implementing policy control measures. So for example, in China, when they had their one-child policy, and you can see that, just reducing the population size in general isn't so simple. Like how do you determine who's allowed to reproduce and who's not allowed to reproduce, and how many children they're allowed to have in a way that still recognizes that everyone has their own autonomy and their own right to make decisions. And also, if you do something that's like a blanket one-child policy like China, we can see that that also doesn't solve the problem, because it brings up a lot of issues later on. Like for example, they have a crazy aging population right now and a huge disparity between the size of their youth population today and the size of their aging population. So that is going to bring about all sorts of other problems, such as like economically related issues. There's going to be a lot of like social burden on the children to support not only their parents but also both sets of grandparents, because there's no one else there in the family. There's all sorts of other issues that arise from this one-child policy or population control measure. And then the last thing I talked about in that essay was this third perspective, which is the fact that, even if we could control the population in a way that avoided all of these other issues, that doesn't actually solve climate change itself. Like, yes, it might slow climate change, but the actual problem here is not that we have a large population. The problem is that we don't use resources in a sustainable way that allows us to continue indefinitely. So even if we do slow down population growth, we are going to still be, running out of resources, affecting the climate, maybe at a slower rate, but eventually we're still going to end at the same endpoint, which is that we're going to run out of resources for the human population. So really another perspective needs to be considered here, which is not so much the fact that there needs to be a cap on the population, but maybe the way in which we use resources and the types of resources that we use themselves needs to be evaluated as a means to actually tackle climate change in a sustainable way more effectively. Okay, so I feel like I just rambled heaps then. I don't really know if that made sense. Hopefully it did. What I'm trying to get across is that when you're writing a section 2 essay, don't be so rigid in your writing style. You don't have to have a title. You don't need to have quote the news or quote some book that you've read or anything like that. You just need to write from your heart with passion and try to make it a little bit different if you can, just so it's a bit more interesting, and also try to encompass multiple perspectives and multiple facets to your argument if possible. Another thing that I find is really important is actually your mindset and how you feel on the day. And I know that sounds super cliche or whatever, but it is really important and it does make a huge difference. You really need to make sure you're feeling really good on the day, feeling like you can smash the exam. Otherwise, it's really easy to get psyched out. Even just going into the room and seeing like 2,000 other people, that is so overwhelming, and it can really make you feel quite insecure in yourself, and that affects your performance in the exam. It means that you're less likely to take risks in your essay, you are less confident in your answers in the multiple choice, and you know, that just has a flow-on effect to how you're going to perform. So you really need to make sure you're in that positive mindset. How I personally get into that positive mindset is the night before I will be listening to some positive affirmations on YouTube, and that sounds really lame, but it really helps. You know, the you can do it kind of videos. And then I'll make sure I have a good night's sleep, maybe have a bubble bath, and then in the morning I'll wake up early, wash my face, you know, I'll do some makeup so I feel good. Make sure you're wearing layers because the temperature does vary quite a lot. And then I try to get to the exam early because I personally get so anxious when I'm lining up with everyone else and just hearing what everyone else has done to prep essentially, and like what I haven't done to prep. So I don't want to hear that. Just want to go in, get to my seat early, put my stuff down, have a little walk before I do the exam. So I recommend getting there early. In terms of what to eat, it really depends on you. So if you're the type of person that always has breakfast, I definitely recommend that. But if you're like me who generally doesn't have breakfast, like I wouldn't be breaking from the routine just because you've got an exam. Like I know that I get really anxious right before the exam, and if I start eating and my stomach will start gurgling heaps, which really puts me off. So I generally don't eat before any big exam, but again, just follow what's natural for yourself. The one thing I do take though is caffeine. So I'm not a regular coffee consumer, but before the GAMSAT I do take one caffeine pill, and I take another one in the lunch break just because I do feel like it's a really long day, and that just keeps me, I don't know if it's placebo or not, but it does help me feel like I'm a little bit more awake. So definitely consider having a coffee or even no dose if you feel like you're going to get tired and, you know, burn out during the day, because it's an endurance test as well, and you don't want to be getting really tired, especially in the afternoon section where it's just like 170 minutes of just pure science. So yeah, make sure you're all caffeinated. In the lunch break, I personally just, again, not the best, but I just eat finger food because I get really stressed out and I don't want to eat anything too heavy. So I generally have some M&Ms and some salted peanuts, and that's it, just to nibble on while I am again listening to some positive vibes online, just trying to get into the zone. I generally don't like talking to friends or other people during the day, just because, again, I don't want to hear about how much other people studied or how they've found certain sections when that's already over. Like, it's too late to go back and change your answer, it's too late to go and study anymore. So I just don't want to put myself in a position where I'm potentially going to feel psyched out. So just prefer to be by myself, eating my M&Ms and listening to some positive vibes, taking my other no-dos, and then going back to finish the science section. Another thing I do want to add though is that if you've never done the GAMSAT before and you're considering doing it for the first time but you don't feel like you've prepped enough, just do it anyway. That's my advice, because at the end of the day, the best preparation for GAMSAT is the GAMSAT itself. Not only because you see what the real exam is like, but because you also get all the other factors that you can't practice for as well, such as just being in that room with everyone else and being under those like time conditions. So yeah, even if you haven't studied for the GAMSAT, consider taking it anyway as preparation for your actual attempt that you're going to study really hard for, because it does definitely improve your performance, because it improves the way in which you feel while you're in the exam. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Good luck. Let me know how you go, and let me know if there's anything else I can do to help you guys get through the exam.